Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us to celebrate Endangered Species Day. My name is Casey Arndt, and I'm the Center Director for Richardson Bay Audubon Center and Sanctuary located in Tiburon, California. Today, I'm joined by three of my incredible Audubon colleagues to help me celebrate Endangered Species Day. We're going to be joined this morning by Robert, who's a seasonal ornithologist at STARR Ranch Sanctuary located in Southern California, as well as Stacy, our environmental education director and partner from LA Audubon. And finally, we're going to wrap up today's program by meeting Tanya, the program coordinator for Audubon Center at Debs Park. So to begin, let's start with a definition. Next slide. What is an endangered species? An endangered species is an animal or a plant that is endangered of becoming extinct throughout all or a huge significant portion of its range. Next slide. Now, the Endangered Species Act is an incredibly important piece of legislation. It was passed by the United States Congress in 1973, and its purpose was to protect and help recover imperiled species, plants and animals, as well as their ecosystems in which they depend. A species can be listed as either endangered or threatened, and a threatened species is one that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. Across the United States, there are 2,531 species that are listed as either threatened or endangered. Specifically here in California, we have 283 species that are listed. The most impressive thing about the Endangered Species Act is that it has been 99% successful at preventing extinction. Next slide. Now, why should we protect endangered species? Endangered and threatened species of wildlife and plants, they have ecological and educational, historical, and scientific value. And because every living thing is part of a balanced network, the removal of a single species can cause a chain reaction. And one of my favorite authors, Rachel Carson, wrote in Silent Spring, "In nature, nothing exists alone." Today, we're going to be learning about two important birds that Audubon is working every day to protect. And later, we're going to look at what each of us can do in our everyday lives to help these incredible creatures. With that said, I'd love to introduce Robert. As I mentioned, Robert's an ornithologist at STARR Ranch Sanctuary, which is located in Southern California, and he's going to be sharing a little bit about a bird that is very near and dear to his heart. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning, Casey. Good morning, everyone else. Thank you for attending this today. All right, so I'll be talking to you about the California gnatcatcher and the work we do to monitor and protect this bird on STARR Ranch Sanctuary. Next slide. So California gnatcatchers, here's a nice photo of a male California gnatcatcher. They are small songbirds, usually a little bit smaller than a warbler. They have a nice long tail. The males have a black cap, nice white eye ring, and they're bluish, whitish on the undersides. And the females, if we look at the next photo here, go next on this slide. There we go. They do not have a black cap. So males and females look a little bit different. And they have a pretty unique vocalization. The sound they make sounds a lot like a cat. I'm going to play some of their calls here. So if you can hear that, that's an actual recording of a gnatcatcher. It's very cat-like scold that they make. Next slide. So California gnatcatchers, you pretty much only find them in this type of habitat. This is called coastal sage scrub habitat. And usually you're going to hear them making those calls more likely than you are to see them. And they pretty much spend their whole lives in this environment. Next slide. So the California sage scrub is pretty much unique to Southern California. You can really only find it in the low elevation coastal foothills, and it harbors a lot of different plant and animal diversity. California gnatcatchers will actually spend their entire lives in the coastal sage scrub. They're not migratory, so they'll defend a territory year-round, about 5 to 8 acres or so. Usually it's a little bit larger in the wintertime, and in the spring and summer when they breed, it gets a little bit smaller. And go to the next slide here. They will nest between about February and into May. Both the males and females will actually do nesting duties and incubate the eggs and attend to the young. Go to the next slide. So the range for California gnatcatchers is pretty limited. A lot of them can be found in Baja California. Outside of that, they're really only confined to coastal Southern California from about Ventura County and Santa Barbara down to the Mexico border. So this is pretty exclusively where there is coastal sage scrub habitat. And this is why they're such a priority to protect, because of that limited range. Go to the next slide. Or, yeah, there we go. So there's not many gnatcatchers left. Global population is about 80,000 birds and declining. There's a unique subspecies that can be found in California. They are listed as threatened under the US Endangered Species Act. And they're pretty important because they're considered an indicator species for this coastal sage scrub habitat. That means if you're not finding gnatcatchers there, it's probably not a good habitat for many other species as well. Go to the next slide to learn a bit about the threats that they face. So the biggest threat for California gnatcatchers by far is habitat loss. Since the middle of the 20th century, the coastal sage scrub habitat they use has declined by over 80%. This figure here from a scientific study, all that little green stippling is the current range and extent of coastal sage scrub habitat. The colored circles are where the study was observing gnatcatcher populations. And that gray area, I mean, that's Los Angeles, that's the urban development. That is all where there used to be coastal sage scrub habitat. So there's really not much of that left. That yellow star, by the way, in the middle, that's where STARR Ranch is located. That's where we are. So now gnatcatchers don't have much habitat left. Other threats they face include climate change, which is expected to reduce their habitat by about another 40% over the next 50 years. And then invasive species present another threat as well. And these are things like non-native weeds and noxious plants that can take over that coastal sage scrub ecosystem. So those all really kind of tie back into that idea of habitat loss. Okay, next slide. So with that in mind, at STARR Ranch, we're working hard to protect this native habitat. STARR Ranch is about 4,500 acres, so about half of our habitat is protected coastal sage scrub. And over the last few decades, we've restored another 650 acres of habitat without the use of herbicides and other harmful chemicals. A lot of that habitat under the previous property owners about 100 years ago was cattle ranching. So a lot of that habitat was degraded. So we've been working hard to restore that. And you could go to the next slide here. Naturalists here about 30 years ago identified 22 gnatcatcher territories. But after that, we hadn't really done much monitoring of them until pretty recently. So see the next slide here describes some of the more recent monitoring that we've done. So in 2011, we started this technique called point count surveys every spring for these gnatcatchers, and we'll share that data with federal agencies that are interested in protecting these birds as well. So we're going to show you a video here that has me walk through what these point count surveys are like. So Hamar, you could play that video now. Well, it's another beautiful morning here at STARR Ranch in our coastal sage scrub habitat. And I'm going to show you what it's like to do one of our California gnatcatcher point count surveys. So right now I'm actually arriving at one of our point count locations marked here by that blue flag. And I can use this GPS device here, will help me navigate to all these different points we have. And basically all I'm doing is I'm standing at this point for a set amount of time. In this case, we'll do it for 10 minutes. And I pretty much just count all the birds around me. And what I've got here is a little data sheet. This is what we're recording our information on. And before I begin the survey, I usually take some other information on that data sheet, such as some weather observations, get the start time down, and then I'm quietly looking for and listening for birds. The listening part is important because a lot of times you're just going to hear them as opposed to see them. You know, these gnatcatchers are hanging out in that, this dense vegetation. So you really got to have a good ear to identify them. And as I find them, I'll record information such as the time of the survey I detected them at, how far away they are. If they're within 50 meters, I try and estimate that distance. And then you also get some behavior information and any other relevant notes as well. So we have 17 of these points throughout STARR Ranch. We visit them 5 times a season between February and May. We do those repeat visits to help us increase the chances that we actually detect the birds that we want to get. Because sometimes a bird might be around and they may be quiet some mornings. So going multiple times a season can improve your chances of getting that bird. And that's the case for this site here. There's usually a pair of gnatcatchers that's usually pretty vocal, not far from the point, but they were pretty quiet this morning. So I didn't get them today. Today was the last survey at this point for the season, but I've picked them up a few other times. So this is some pretty nice sage grub habitat. Really good for the gnatcatchers out here, and a good number of other birds out here we can listen for too. So yeah, there you have it. That's a little flavor of these gnatcatcher surveys. Okay, yeah, that video was taken just a couple days ago. So let's look just a little bit at some of the results we've gotten from these surveys so far. This is showing you about the last 6 years of data. Basically, this graph, all it's showing you is of those survey points we went to, what % of them each year had gnatcatchers found there. And one thing to note is that earlier on, around 2014, we didn't have as many points as we do now. We've kind of steadily added a few in 2015, 2016. So that kind of accounts for that little drop off you see between 2014 and 2015. But over the last few years, we usually go between about maybe 40 to 70% of the points we go to have gnatcatchers. So if we kind of continue with this protocol for a few more years, we may be able to see some more trends take shape as well. So go to the next slide, and I'll just quickly mention another project that I've been helping out with for these gnatcatchers. So I described some of the data that we've been collecting here at STARR Ranch for a while. Starting in 2016, the US government with the US Geological Survey and the Fish and Wildlife Service started this region-wide monitoring effort where they recruit other government agencies, land managers, wildlife biologists, and environmental consultants throughout the region to do these surveys every 4 years. And as opposed to the point count surveys that I talked about, these are a little bit different. I go to an area that's about 150 square meters, a couple sites like that in the coastal sage scrub, and I actually go through for about 45 minutes and just try and find whatever gnatcatchers I can. So as opposed to standing in one place, I'm kind of moving through the habitat instead and doing that a few times. And there's dozens of other biologists doing that throughout the region every 4 years. And after we do that, we also do some vegetation recording too. We look at things like vegetation density and the diversity of different types of species there. We're trying to see what little traits of the habitat can actually influence how likely a gnatcatcher is to be using that environment. And that's pretty important for land managers and conservationists going forward. So that really covers the main projects we've been working on to help learn about and protect this really cute charismatic species in the coastal sage scrub.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Robert. I think when the shelter in place lifts up by me, I'm going to have to come down south and help with one of those point count surveys.
Yeah, it's definitely a great place to have sheltered in place for the last few weeks, I'll say. Right,
yes, I am jealous. And as you were speaking, I thought it might be good for us to just clarify for our viewers. You're talking about the California gnatcatcher, and the actual endangered species version is a subspecies. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's an important distinction. I had a slide early on and kind of mentioned it briefly that it's the coastal subspecies, and that's pretty much what you find here in California is the coastal subspecies of gnatcatcher. There are other gnatcatcher subspecies that can be found in Baja California and elsewhere in Mexico. So the ones around here in Orange County and Los Angeles County, Ventura County, those are pretty much all the coastal subspecies. That's the one that we're really concerned about.
Great. So for our viewers, if you do have any questions for Robert, please go ahead and throw them in the chat box. We're actually going to be taking questions after our next presentation. That being said, I would love to take this opportunity to introduce Stacy. Stacy is the Environmental Education Director for LA Audubon. Stacy, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get a little nerdy about plovers with everyone, so thanks for joining us. My name's Stacy Vigilon. I'm Director of Environmental Education, and I'm also a project biologist for Los Angeles Audubon. And we've been fortunate to have Audubon California as a collaborator for a long time on our monitoring projects as well. So next slide, please. So first off, I like to sort of give you an intro to what this creature looks like. And it is an exceptionally cute creature. So an adult snowy plover can fit in the palm of your hand. The chicks are even tinier and fluffier. Plovers have a small black bill. They have a dark mark that does not form a complete ring around the neck. So that's a good field mark for distinguishing it from other small shorebirds. They have a white breast and belly. And the adults, the chicks, and the eggs are all sand colored. So camouflage is the name of the game for snowy plovers. So next slide, please. So just to sort of test everybody's observational skills really quick, imagine you're a biologist at the beach or a very committed volunteer and you are out helping us survey. Let's take maybe 5 to 10 seconds to try to figure out how many snowy plovers we can see in this photo. And again, these guys are good at their job, so they're very good at hiding. We need like a countdown. Okay, next slide. So if you guessed in the double digits, that's pretty good. Again, these guys tend not to flush and fly away like you're walking through a flock of pigeons. They tend to sort of hang in there and wait for you to pass. When we watch joggers go through them, they sort of creep away and then they creep right back. So they rely on tracks in the sand to sort of sit and remain practically invisible. They're excellent hiders. Next slide, please. So snowy plover is kind of a broad term. So the snowy plover is a species, and you can find snowy plovers in the Pacific and the Gulf coasts, as well as some sandy habitats on inland lakes and rivers. So the western snowy plover refers to the subspecies that's in our western states. And again, you may find them in some inland lakes, river areas. And then for most of today, and the biological unit that is federally listed is the Pacific coast population of the western snowy plover. And these are the guys that are on the orange line on our map. So from Washington down through Baja. And it's the Pacific coast population that's federally threatened. Next slide. And just some natural history about these guys. Again, being hidden is the name of the game. So we've got 2 adults here that are roosting. We've got an image of a 3-egg nest. Plovers nest directly on the sand. And again, as you can imagine, especially in a place like Los Angeles, that can be a real conservation challenge. We also see a photo of a whole bunch of snowy plovers foraging along the rack line. So the brown stuff you see in that photo is the washed up kelp and other seaweed. And you wouldn't think to look at them, but plovers are vicious predators. If you are a beach invertebrate, they are your worst nightmare. So the plovers spend a lot of time foraging along the rack. And that whole rack ecosystem is a very rich place. You've got all of these invertebrates living their life cycle in the washed up kelp, and you've got plovers and other shorebirds rooting around trying to find those guys. Next slide. And again, since our focus is Los Angeles, this is very much an urban ecology and action conservation issue. And I think when a lot of people think of Los Angeles, they think of that top photo, that sort of like summer fun, mobs and mobs of people. And I don't think people necessarily think wildlife when they think about our beaches. And we certainly have a lot of people-related issues to contend with in snowy plover conservation. So we have people and dogs on the beach, the associated trash and food waste with that, local residences that may be feeding pets, feral cats, outside cats, and we also have species that do really well around people. So animals like crows and raccoons who happily eat French fries left on the beach and then eggs as well if they find them. And associated with all that busyness of people, you have things like beach grooming, which you need to do in order to keep the beach trash free. We also have trash washing up when we have major rain events. So there's a lot that goes on our beaches. And next slide. And this is sort of why we have conservation issues with snowy plovers, and the California coast in general has a lot of issues with habitat loss and increased just sort of people presence. So again, that Pacific coast population of the western snowy plover is federally threatened. I believe they were listed in 1993, so it's been a while. One of the things that we really like to explain, especially to folks who live in cities where and like where we are, where the beach is part of our city's culture, is understanding how and why wildlife uses our beaches. So thinking about how plovers maybe got in the situation where they are in now. So next slide, please. So let's envision the LA coast hundreds of years ago, and we certainly had people here, right? Indigenous folks used the oceans, used the beaches, but we didn't have the population density that we had. So next slide. So lots of space for plovers and other species like California least terns to have colonies and nest sites on the beaches. And of course they would have their natural predators, but for the most part, plenty of space. So next slide. If we kind of zoom into the early 1900s, things started to get a little more developed, but still overall, lots of habitat for snowy plovers and least terns. So next slide. Thinking about LA in particular, and then in a time in the 1940s when we really had a huge boom in urbanization here, you have increased development. You also have new infrastructure that makes it easier to visit areas that were once remote. And so you start seeing impacts on beach nesting species. So next slide. And then this is pretty much what it looks like today. So you have a lot of human impacts. We're bringing biological input that wasn't there before in the form of trash, which then attracts predators. You still have things like raptors and coyotes that would have been natural predators, but you're attracting more people and you're attracting more predators to a site where birds have their eggs directly on the sand. You also have a lot of those associated cleanup type activities and maintaining the beach for public health that also impacts birds that roost and nest directly on the sand. So next slide. And because LA is a people place, people are not going to be going away anytime soon. And I think even if you're someone who lives here, you tend to view the beach as the place you go in the summer. And so a lot of the work that we've done has been focused on outreach. So having people view the beach as a place to connect to and explore the natural world year round. So next slide. So since 2007, we have been running a community-based science program. It involves the local birding community, LA residents, students. It's been a fantastic opportunity to collaborate with our neighboring Audubon chapters, Santa Monica Bay Audubon, PV South Bay Audubon, Pasadena Audubon. And it gets people directly involved in the process of science. So the data collected through this endeavor gets sent to beach managers and wildlife agencies, and we typically produce an annual report that's made public. So it's been a way for agencies to capitalize on public interest in collecting data where it might be challenging for just one or two biologists to cover all the beaches necessary. Next slide. We've also been collaborating with beach recreation facilities to offer beach walks for the public, specifically in the fall and the winter, so those off times, which if you're not familiar with Los Angeles, our beaches are absolutely gorgeous in the fall and the winter. You have the place to yourself. You have all the winter residents that are hanging out with us that would normally be in Alaska or farther away in the summer. And we're finding that people who participate in these activities are really new to birding. And the existence of a snowy plover is news to them, and they come away with a much greater awareness of a beach that they had been maybe visiting for 20 years, and they hadn't really made the connection that beaches are habitat. So next slide. And we also set up a field trip program for public schools, and we try to target Title I schools in particular, so students who may not have a lot of opportunity to go to the beach on their own or might be quite distant from the beach in terms of LA traffic time or access to transportation. This is an opportunity for students to do science in real time, to also connect other skills of observation. So drawing is really big in our program. In addition to collecting data, drawing is another way to collect observations and data. So students leave with a field notebook and a whole host of questions that they can follow up on once they return to the classroom. Next slide. And one of the wonderful advantages of partnering with local schools is that you get students in on the art, and they have a lot to say, and they can come up with some really fantastic ideas that they want to share with the public. So we've been able to use student drawings to create signages in some of our protected areas. And this is, over 10 years, has remained one of my favorites. It was by a 5th grader, and she did a really beautiful job of articulating visually the habitat that plovers need. She's got a little banded plover in the front. She's got the field marks. She has evidence that people are also using the beach. And her slogan was fantastic, which I think is very apropos of conservation in LA, in that you might be hurting what you can't see. So final slide. And again, many thanks to all of our partnering organizations. Conservation is a team effort. Like, collaboration year after year is absolutely essential. So again, a big thanks to Audubon California for supporting the work that we've been doing. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Stacy. You know, I didn't think it was possible for me to like snowy plovers anymore, but hearing you talk about it, you've given me another reason to come down south. So I'm gonna hit up Robert for gnatcatchers, and then I'm gonna come visit you to do some snowy plover work. So it looks like we do have time for a couple of questions. Hamar, do we have any questions in the chat box for either Stacy or Robert?
Yeah, so this one is more of a general question. It comes from Janine. And Janine says that they've noticed yellow finches and red finches sometimes having very frayed feathers. And they were wondering if there was any kind of disease that may specifically cause birds to have frayed feathers like that, that you know of. Oh, you're on mute, Robert.
Yeah, okay, I got it. So yeah, for frayed feathers, sometimes feather wear like that could be pretty natural, regardless of disease throughout a bird's life cycle, especially if a bird, you know, in Southern California, things like sun and just other exposure to the elements can really degrade feathers over time. I'm not super familiar with any potential diseases directly related to that sort of feather degradation. Though with finches, there is a concern a lot with eye disease that they can pick up from feeders. So there's been a big effort to promote birdseed feeders to keep those clean a lot, because finches can definitely pass a lot of sort of eye disease and other pathogens like that. But as far as feather wear, sometimes that can happen to a lot of different species, regardless of disease.
Thanks for that. Another question comes from Terrence, and Terrence asks, how do the western snowy plovers differ from the ones on the Gulf Coast?
I don't think there is a big appreciable difference other than perhaps genetics. Again, they all nest on the sand. If you head to the Gulf states, you'll see a creature that looks very much like what you would see here. But in terms of conservation, the ones that are of most concern, mainly from all those development pressures, and then now, of course, sea level rise, is that Pacific Coast population. But if you came to LA and had a good lock-on ID for snowy plovers, if you went to a Gulf state, you'd have pretty good luck finding them there too, in terms of your ID skills.
Another snowy plover question from Leslie. And she asks, have snowy plovers moved into the Los Angeles beaches in the absence of humans during COVID-19?
Excellent question. So public access has been challenging, and that's been for us biologists too, in trying to get out to sites and getting the permits and the paperwork. So there's some sites where we haven't been able to check as frequently as we like. But I have been checking Dockweiler Beach very frequently. I was just at Zuma yesterday to do surveys. In Orange County, they were finding nests in areas that had been really quiet in terms of people. And so now with beaches being reopened, that's definitely another conservation that Orange County we'll be having to look into. And Sea and Sage Audubon, like if you have Orange County questions, Sea and Sage Audubon are your folks. They do similar programming, and we partner with them as well. I should have mentioned them as a partner earlier.
Thanks. Another question for Robert about the gnatcatchers. Terrence noticed a lot of cacti in your video and was wondering if that had anything, or if that came into effect when they were hunting insects.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is oftentimes clusters of cactus throughout the coastal sage-grouse habitat. That means when I'm going through there doing surveys, I have to be pretty careful to watch my step so I don't, get impaled. But gnatcatchers definitely will utilize the cactus. There's that photo I showed of the nest that they will even nest within cactus sometimes. As far as foraging goes, they will definitely pick off insects from cactus as well. Things like spiders, or there's little insects called cochineal bugs that kind of nest or have this nice like little white scaly things going on the cactus. You'll eat those too. A lot of times I actually see them hovering around and just kind of picking off the insects while hovering around cactus, so they avoid damaging themselves on the spines as well. But they definitely will utilize cactus for foraging too.
Back to Stacy for another sort of COVID-related question. Are there any policies that you know of specifically about protecting nests that are being built by terns and plovers during the shutdowns?
Not specific policies, no. And I would say one of the challenges of snowy plover conservation is that the beaches are not managed by one entire entity. Even in LA County, just to sort of give an LA County example, we have cities like the city of Santa Monica that manages a beach. We have LA County Beaches and Harbors, which manages certain beaches. And we have California State Parks, which has state beaches, some of which are managed by beaches and harbors at the county level. So it's it can be very confusing, and it requires a lot of communication and a lot of different policy or just implementation strategies. And I think you see something similar in Orange County as well, where you have a real patchwork, as well as armed forces along the California coast. So really different ways to manage all of that same listed species. When we find a nest, we let agencies know right away so that we can be collaborating as soon as possible on how to protect that nest.
Awesome. I guess this is more of a species question for Robert. Are there any marked sort of differences between the blue-gray gnatcatchers and the California gnatcatchers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They do look pretty similar superficially. Usually, the sound, the voice is a good way to set them apart. They can kind of sound pretty similar if you don't have too much familiarity with them, but that nice cat-like scold for the California gnatcatcher is a really good giveaway. Blue-gray gnatcatcher, usually their vocalizations are a little bit, I kind of think of them as a little bit hoarser or kind of like whinier, raspier type noise. And then we have the males for the gnatcatcher. The California gnatcatchers have that nice black cap. So you won't see a male blue-gray gnatcatcher, female blue-gray gnatcatcher with that much black. And then there's some other subtle differences in the amount of white on the underside of the tail, but it's usually pretty hard to notice that in the field. So you're usually just, the sound is usually the biggest giveaway.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And I think this one is going to Casey because it's a Bay Area plover management question. Aaron asks if there's anything in particular to note about plover conservation in the Bay Area, and if people going to the beach with dogs off leash has been a problem.
That's a great question. And I would say that the issues in the Bay Area are very similar to the ones that Stacy talked about down in LA. Dogs off leash, lots of access to beaches that we're sharing with plovers. That is always going to be a problem. So we do share the same concerns that Stacy does down in LA. We absolutely support keeping dogs on leashes and bringing dogs to places that dogs can be. I'm a dog owner and I understand how great it is to bring your dog places with you. I always bring him to places that I know there aren't going to be nesting birds. That is such a fantastic question, and we will be following up with all of you via email, and we'll try and address these questions in more detail as well. Well, with that, thank you so much to everyone on the call that's continuing to engage with us. Please keep those questions coming. At this time, I'm really excited to bring Tanya onto the screen. Tanya is the program coordinator for our Audubon Center at Debs Park, also located in LA. And Tanya, it's my understanding that you're taking us on a bit of a tour today.
Hi, everyone. That is correct. Hi, everyone. Once again, my name is Tanya. I am the program coordinator here at the Audubon Center at Debs Park. For folks that are not familiar with Ernest E. Debs Park, we're a regional park located about less than miles from downtown Los Angeles. So we're definitely super close. In fact, I can actually pretty much see downtown from here, which is really interesting. We are about 282 acres and all with a variety of different uses, some hiking trails, some recreational areas like picnic sites, barbecue areas, but also an area that has substantial habitat for a lot of our bird communities. So similar to what Casey mentioned, I will be taking you on a tour today. I'm currently at our Los Nogales nursery. So I'll be giving you a tour of our nursery and also just a quick tour of some of the birds that we can see here on site. Now, you're probably wondering, oh, well, I thought we were here to talk about endangered species, so why am I gonna take a tour of the nursery? Well, I wanna talk to you a little bit about what are some things we can do to be able to support our endangered species as just, common citizens or people in general. So one of the things that I wanna talk about is native plants. Okay, and something about native plants is there is a great importance in being able to plant native plants and provide habitat in general for our birds. Now, this could be in a variety of different ways. It can be in your home, whether it's a garden, whether it's container planting, or whether it's going out and volunteering to do some of these larger restoration efforts. But I guess one of the questions I get often is, well, why? Why are native plants important? Can't I just plant anything I really want in my garden? Yes, you can. And honestly, any type of habitat will really sustain some form of wildlife. But something that we have found specifically in Audubon is that native plants actually are able to support a lot of our local native wildlife a lot more than a lot of other plants that maybe are invasive or are non-native to the area. Now, I also get a common question on what are native plants. So native plants are plants that have been in a geographic area since the beginning of time, specifically before human development or colonization. So what that means is that if we were to go to this pristine area, or specifically here in Los Angeles, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, these are the plants that you will naturally find here. Now, native plants exist all over the world, and all native plants can vary depending on geographic region. So the native plants that I find here in California are probably not the native plants I find in Florida, are probably not the native plants I find in Mexico, because every geographic area has its own native plant community. With that said, native plants are able to support a lot more food, shelter, and overall resources to a lot of our native wildlife. Why? Well, because they grew up with those plants. So they are familiar with the food, how to use it. They're familiar of like how they grow and etc. As opposed to an invasive plant or a non-native plant that was brought. So I want to go ahead and give you a quick tour of some of the things that we're doing here at the Audubon Center at that park. We're actually going through a huge habitat restoration enhancement, specifically here at Ernest E. Debs Regional Park. When it comes to a lot of our Debs Park area, we have a mixture of a native community and also a non-native invasive, specifically grass, all over our site. So one of the things that we have done is being able to instill a Los Nogales nursery. So we will actually collect seed from all over the park, be able to seed it into flats, and then propagate them, transplant them, and overall get them to a substantial size to actually be outplanted into different sites, similar to this guy here. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of the work that we're doing here. If you have any questions, go ahead and continue putting them in the chat box, and we'll definitely have a couple minutes to be able to answer some of those at the end of the tour. All right, cool. So here, I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen real quick, give you a quick view of what we have out here. So out here are actually the size that we decide. This is the optimal size that we use to be able to outplant them into any site. So you want to get them about a gallon size, which is the size that we decide to go with. And this is only because a lot of the survival rate will go ahead and increase once, you know, they're bigger. Of course, some of them will go ahead and put into bigger containers, but for the most part, it's our gallon size. That's a manageable size for us to work with and be able to outplant, to be able to really enforce our efforts. Now, how do we get them to that size? Like I mentioned, we collect a lot of seed from our park, our plants that are already established around our park, and we go ahead and first seed them in flats. So we'll go ahead and create a flat. We'll go ahead and seed them appropriately. And then, as you'll see, seedlings will sprout out, similar to here. So this is actually our Salvia mellifera, which is a black sage. So one of our chaparral sage scrub plants that's actually very aromatic. This is our white sage. This is a bush sunflower. Another type of sage, this is Salvia leucophila, which is a purple sage. And then a Camellia. So we'll go ahead and first put them here in these flats. Like I mentioned, they'll grow in little seedlings. After they reach that optimal size, more like these Encelias and these Salvia melliferas, then we'll go through a process of transplanting. Now, transplanting means that you're carefully going to go ahead and pick some of these seedlings up, making sure that the roots are intact, and you're going to go ahead and put them up in a bigger container. Now, when plants are growing, you want to go ahead and be able to provide them enough water, enough space. So most of that transplanting is to be able to give them optimal space.
Hey,
So
Tanya, we're
yes?
getting some comments that if you could just hold the camera in place a little slower when you're showing each thing.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, folks. So here is our next stage of that flat stage. It's the seedling bumping up stage. And here we'll go ahead and put them in containers. And these containers will give them an optimal size to be able to grow more fully. So you can see that more depth to be able to really have them grow those roots to what they need. And they'll stay here depending on plant, anywhere from 2 months to maybe 6 months, some of them even a year, just based on what kind of plant they are. So for instance, these that are actually trees or a large shrub, which is a holly leaf cherry, will have actually been here for almost a year. It's going to be a year in August, but some of them, you know, will only stay here 6 months, a couple months before they get bumped to that final guideline stage, which is pretty cool. Now, I think a common misconception as well when it comes to native plants, especially in California, is that our native plants are just cacti, just succulents. So that is not the case. While it is true that we do have cacti and succulents that are native plants, that is not what all of our native plants consist of. So actually here in our nursery, we have a variety of different native plants, and a lot of them waver. Some of them can be trees, such as this laurel sumac here, right? Well, actually it's more of a large shrub that is almost borderline tree, I think. Our laurel sumac, they will grow big. Some of it's our buckwheat, like we have here. Now, some of it is our donut, which we have here, which is another large tree. Some of it is grass. Some is definitely flower galores, like our golden currant. Here, up here. Then some of it is more flower galore, like our sticky monkey flower that actually started flying. So this flowering, so this means we have to go ahead here. Then there's also definitely grasses, vines, so anything you can really think of. So it's not just cacti or succulent, even though that is definitely also a portion of our native plants. But you can definitely find native plants that are suitable to any garden, any habitat, but also that are aesthetically pleasing, which I think is just a common misconception when it comes to a lot of our native plants here in California. So one of the things that we can definitely do to help a lot of our endangered species is be able to plant native plants and provide that habitat that a lot of them need. And that's only because like Robert mentioned and Stacy mentioned, a lot of our endangered species, one of its major threats is habitat loss. So by being able to provide habitat in general, then we're able to counteract or minimally obviate some of those effects. But imagine how would that look like if every garden had native plants or something that can substantially be able to support our species. Then it would turn one small action into a bigger action, one small garden, and now to a full geographic area, which in the long term can definitely support some of these endangered species. Right now, we're gonna go ahead on a quick also bird walk around the park in this little area, because I also want to show you how these native plants look like once they're already established, and also how these native plants are also supporting some of our bird friends. So let me go ahead and show you what these guys look like. So I'm gonna be walking outside of Los Nogales nursery, and right out here, we're gonna reach our Los Flores Trail. And then Los Flores Trail, a lot of this has been planted. This was a huge habitat restriction a couple of years back. So, and then a lot of this is already pretty much native plants. Now compare a lot of here on the left-hand side to our invasive grass, which not only does it really not provide a lot of our, food, shelter for a lot of wildlife, it's also a huge fire hazard. So native plants are out here, and we have a combination of them. We have our Camellia, which is these with their small tube-like flowers that support tons of hummingbirds. So actually here in our Flores Trail, this is like hummingbird galore. You'll constantly see hummers here. And you have our California wild rose. Oh, look, you have a pollinator on a California wild rose. Look at our little honeybee. So this definitely provides ample habitat to be able to find that shelter and that food. Lots of butterflies as well. So this is just one way that we can go ahead and support a lot of our endangered species. The other way that is pretty easy and I like to talk about is being able to respect our wildlife spaces. Now, here at that park, I find a lot of illegal the issue is that there's multiple illegal trails. So then that connectivity of that habitat cannot continue, and it disrupts a lot of that. So one of the things that we can also do is be able to just stay in our legal trails, be able to keep our dogs on leash, to be able to stop a little bit of that habitat fragmentation. And overall, also when we're visiting a lot of our wildlife spaces, be able to leave no trace. So we're going to leave the habitat intact better or the same way like when we found it. So if we have a picnic out there, let's pick up our trash. Let's go ahead and pack out everything that we brought in and etc. That also includes dog waste. And I know there's also another common misconception that, well, I'm eating an apple. Can't I just like, throw the pit in the ground? You can, it will biodegrade, but because it's not native to that area, it will biodegrade at a much slower rate as opposed to something that's within that area. So it's actually not helpful, and it's not recommended to be able to throw even some of our food sources that are biodegradable. And you can hear a little bit about the lesser goldfinch. Oh, we just had a California towhee stop by. And yeah, folks, those are just some couple ways that you can help some of these endangered species. Let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you so much for that great virtual tour and the hike. I am jealous, even though it looks like I'm sitting in the mountains. I am actually in my house right now, and I am very jealous that you are outdoors right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a privilege to be outdoors right now. And, I am carrying my mask everywhere, just FYI. And I am also in an area of a park that is actually close to the public right now. So we do encourage that. I get it. Like a lot of us are probably antsy to be outside, but definitely take a lot of our safety of yourself and the community into consideration.
Yes, I echo Tanya. I know as the director at Richardson Bay Audubon Center, I am really excited to reopen and welcome folks back to our community, as I'm sure Tanya is to have folks back on their trails. So with that being said, we are slowly ticking away to the top of the hour, but Hamar, I think we do have a couple of minutes to take some questions. Are there any questions in the chat box specifically for Tanya about Debs Park?
Yeah. So talking about some of the native plants that Tanya was mentioning, Robert Snyder would like to know if there are any particular native nectar plants to support monarch butterflies that you would recommend for the Palos Verdes Peninsula.
Oh, cool. Yeah, specifically with a lot of our monarch butterfly, what we always recommend is milkweed species. Now there is non-native and native milkweed species. Here at Debs Park, we use narrow-leaf milkweed, which I believe is also a host plant as well that can be planted in the Palos Verdes Peninsula. And specifically, that is the big host plant for monarch butterflies because that is the preference of a lot of the caterpillars. So monarch butterflies are actually toxic, and their toxicity comes from this milkweed species, the narrow milkweed, and other milkweed species as well. That really allows it to thrive. So that is always the plant I recommend whenever folks are thinking about monarch conservation, looking into milkweed species. For here in the Los Angeles area, definitely narrow-leaf milkweed.
Thank you. And a question from Nicole is, how much do you water the native plants once you've planted them on the trail?
Oh, I love that question because I feel like everyone's always like, oh, what? That's crazy. So here on the trail, in order to establish, this has only been taken care for 1 year. And the first year, we go ahead and water them here at the center about once a month. So we water them about 2 gallons once a month. After the first year, they are considered established. And once they're established, you do not have to take care for them ever again. They have adapted to the area, the weather of California, and can thrive just at annual rainfall. Now, a lot of that year of establishment tends to be for our shrubs. Trees will definitely need to be taken care for a little more. But normally no more than 2 to 3 years, and it's very minimal watering compared to a lot of our more non-native and invasive plants. Of course, if you see your plant maybe not happy and maybe needing a little more water, you can definitely give it more than just once a month. But for the most part, they will definitely not have to be watered once every day, once every week. You can definitely get away with like bi-weekly or once a month.
Cool. One of the things that you were talking about during your tour kind of cut out a little. Could you just talk a little bit about the habitat fragmentation you were talking about?
Yeah, so with habitat fragmentation, what happens is, one, it's being able to provide suitable habitat, correct, for a lot of our wildlife. But what happens is, even when we build trails, when we go ahead and build homes, we pretty much disrupt that of that connectedness of that habitat. So what happens with that is that some species are very sensitive to that habitat fragmentation, and that trail will disrupt that connectivity and can really deter a lot of the species from being able to breed there, be able to visit. I know specifically some species require acres of connectivity, some are less versatile and are okay with a little bit of habitat fragmentation, but habitat fragmentation in general for a lot of our more sensitive species, which tend to be a little bit more of our endangered, is really, really important.
I think we have time for one more question, and this can be sort of open to everyone. So Tony asks, lots of herbs that I cook with at home come from plants that are native to California. How can I be sure that the products I purchase come from companies that don't harm local habitats?
That's $1 million question, because I mean, realistically, you just have to do very thorough research. And I think as an individual that is in a way also connected to a lot of our native plants, a lot of the things I do is kind of more being able to do the harvesting myself to be able to really ensure that sustainable component of not over harvesting. Now, I'm not saying all companies like do that, or all nonprofits, or all like organizations, whoever the seller is, does that. But what I try to take a lot in consideration is that when it comes to a lot of sellers, right, they want to meet a quota of whatever, you know, they're trying to reach, whatever dollar amount they're trying to reach, etc. So for me, my best take on that has been being able to harvest myself, and obviously in places that allow it, because there's definitely places that do not allow it, and I feel like that's the only way I have been able to feel comfortable being able to delve into practices like that.
Wonderful. I think that is a perfect comment to go ahead and wrap up on. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of our presenters. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Stacy, for being here today. I'd also like to thank all the community members that joined us today to help celebrate Endangered Species Day. And with that, we will say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your morning. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Everyone, thanks so much.